honoring the legacy of Bill Morlin. Karen Dorn Steele joins us to give special tribute to Bill Morlin, the revered investigative reporter who covered everything from neo-Nazis and white supremacists to crooks and corrupt politicians in a half a century at Spokane newspapers. Respected regionally and nationally for his reporting, Bill was a generous mentor to young journalists and a frequent speaker at universities, including multiple visits to the Murrow College. Introducing this session is Professor Ben Shores, an award-winning journalist and filmmaker specializing in public interest reporting in the Pacific Northwest. His most recent film, The Blackfeet Flood, was produced in partnership with ITVS and Vision Maker Media for national distribution through Local USA. And his series of documentary shorts was selected for online distribution by PBS Indies. A former fellow with the International Center for Journalists, Shores has reported from Germany, Panama, and South Africa. He was a national finalist for the Livingston Award, who recognizes the country's top journalists under the age of 35. His work at Washington State University focuses on diverse rural populations, and he has twice received national educational grants from the Online News Association, most recently for the university's Rural Plunge Training and Engagement Program. He also serves as the project manager for the Murrow News Service. Please welcome Ben Shores.
When they take 25 years of your life and shrink it to 30 seconds, it sounds impressive. Welcome to the closing keynote address of the 47th Murrow Symposium. I hope everyone has had a good time these last few days. But thank you to all our leadership team, in particular Dean Bruce Pinkleton for arranging these events and Anna Wheatley for pulling it off. So just a quick round of applause for everyone. So we're honored to have Karen Dorn Steele, the longtime investigative reporter and author, join us today to honor the life and legacy of the revered late, great Bill Morlin. And I want to acknowledge Bill's family who's joining us here today. His wife, Connie, if you could just raise your hand, Connie, so everyone can see you. His granddaughter, Hannah, his sister-in-law, Cynthia Clausen, and his son, Jeff. So thank you for joining us today. If you aren't familiar with the work of Bill Morlin, you've probably been impacted by it in ways that you don't even know. Bill was one of one. He was a reporter's reporter, a journalist who grew up in the city of Spokane and then spent the next half century covering that city and the surrounding communities. And that reporting wasn't just contained to Spokane, but it reverberated around the nation, from his coverage of a federal standoff at Ruby Ridge in Idaho to the downfall of the Aryan nations in North Idaho. Bill was a tireless investigative reporter who never cowered in the face of terror. When a neo-Nazi pulled a gun on Bill Morlin, Bill kept reporting. When the Aryan nations put him on its hit list, he kept reporting. When an extremist group bombed the Spokesman Review, he kept reporting. Even in retirement, Bill never stopped reporting on hate groups and extremist operations, writing for the Southern Poverty Law Center, as well as national outlets like the New York Times, and in his free time in retirement, starting his own private investigation firm. One employee, Bill. Bill had an encyclopedic knowledge of extremist hate groups in the Pacific Northwest and across the country. The New York Times best-selling author Jess Walter, a longtime friend of Bill's, called him the preeminent investigative journalist of his time, exposing hate and wrongdoing and malfeasance, but also a gentleman who was a selfless father, husband, friend, and colleague, and also a lover of dogs and cats. Jess said, Bill's incredible ability as a reporter was because of who he was, that sense of integrity and purpose. People trusted Bill. They gave him information and knew that he would do the right thing with it. he had a superhero's sense of justice. I would just add a superhero in Dockers. Although the recipient of many awards, that was not what guided Bill's work. Quoting again from Jess Walter, "Get it in the paper, that was Bill's purpose, not to win awards or craft pretty narratives, but to find the story and to get it out there, to find truth." It's my pleasure to have Karen Dorn-Steele here to honor Bill and his legacy. Karen worked closely with Bill through several decades in Spokane media, primarily at the Spokesman Review. Karen is an author, an award-winning investigative reporter and environmental journalist, formerly at the Spokesman Review. And in addition to her extensive work on local, national, and international issues, Karen is perhaps best recognized for breaking the story of nuclear experiments and public health threats at the Hanford nuclear site, and for reporting on the CIA's use of Spokane-based psychologists in their controversial post-9/11 rendition and torture programs. She was the 20th journalist to be inducted into the Washington State Hall of Journalistic Achievement in 1995. During her tenure at the Spokesman, Karen worked closely with Bill on several investigations. She's well acquainted with his career, and she welcomes the opportunity to talk about his search for truth in our aptly named symposium, Legacy of Truth. Please join me in welcoming Karen Dorn-Steele to the stage.
Thanks, Ben. The last time I saw Bill was shortly before he died in November 2021. We were on a panel at Gonzaga Law School recounting the true crime saga of Fred Coe, a serial rapist who terrorized Spokane women 40 years earlier and is now locked up at McNeil Island as a chronic sexual offender. Bill brought along his 1965 Lewis and Clark High School yearbook. It was signed by Coe, a classmate, and the son of Bill's editor, Gordon Coe, at the Spokane Daily Chronicle. This was the future South Hill rapist's message to Bill. "Hiya, kid. 'Tis I, your great buddy. It looks like we made it. I hope you didn't have such a hard time as I will encounter. Good luck, Bill." I mention this as an example of how deeply Bill, a third-generation Spokaneite, was ingrained in his community. He knew cops, private eyes, lawyers, and criminals like Coe. After that yearbook was signed, Bill went on to intern at the Associated Press, and then he joined the staff of the Chronicle and the Spokesman Review, also when the papers were merged in 1983. In decades of dogged work, he became the leading reporter in the nation, as Ben said, on far-right extremist groups. 2 weeks after the Coe Symposium, Bill died of sepsis in the hospital where he was born in 1946. His sudden death was a great shock to us all and a profound loss to journalism. At the time of his death, Bill was working on a book about the rise and fall of the Aryan nations and its leader, Richard Butler. When I joined the Chronicle staff in 1983 after an early career in public television, I already knew that Bill was special. He was turning a spotlight on a network of extremists converging on remote North Idaho with the dream of a whites-only homeland. David Nywert, author of a 1999 book published by WSU Press on this movement, wrote a tribute to Bill for the Daily Kosh a few days after his death. David praised Bill for making extremism his beat. He'd been reading Bill's bylines since the late 70s when he was the 21-year-old editor of the Sandpoint Bee, a small newspaper which had opted not to cover the Aryan Nations compound at Hayden Lake. After all, we figured, these bigots just want publicity, and we weren't going to give it to them, unlike those guys at the Spokane papers. Of course, we all realized within a few years, after the region had become awash in a rising tide of hate crimes, that the Spokane guys had been right, and the rest of us were wrong. The silence not only gave them cover for their activities, but was interpreted by them as an implicit approval. Bill was on this story from the arrival of the Aryan nations in the 1970s. He filed a story when Sid Rosen's Coeur d'Alene restaurant was sprayed with anti-Semitic graffiti in 1980. Bill reported the Ku Klux Klan-style cross burnings and attended the 1986 Aryan World Congress, where Nazi flags draped the Hayden Lake compound. He explained their Christian identity beliefs, a blend of evangelism, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. Bill also covered the Order, an Aryan nation's offshoot that went on a multi-state rampage, murdering a Jewish radio host in Denver, robbing $3 million from an armored truck in California, and finally weakening after the death of leader Robert Matthews in an FBI standoff on Whidbey Island. He wrote about the detonation of 5 small bombs in Coeur d'Alene in 1986, including one which hit the home of the Reverend Bill Wasmuth, a Catholic priest who preached tolerance. Former spokesman reporter Andrea Vogt, now working in Italy as a journalist and a filmmaker, recalls how Bill helped her as she wrote Common Courage, a book on Wasmuth, the priest. When you were getting tips or background from Bill, you had the distinct feeling you were working in the shadow of a journalism giant, Vogt said. According to journalist Leah Sotile, a young journalist, Bill even monitored the gravestones of the dead extremists, finding the racist totems left by mourners. Years later, Bill was able to explain to her the symbols displayed by rioters in the videos of the January 6, 2021 insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Bill was never afraid of the Aryan nations members, according to former Spokesman Review reporter Jess Walter, who is now a best-selling author. Bill was a reporting mentor to Jess when he first joined the newspaper in the late 1980s. And this is a photo of Butler getting arrested in Coeur d'Alene, trying to do a Nazi protest inside a hotel in Coeur d'Alene. Said Jess Walter, Bill was direct with the Aryans. Bill would get in their faces and ask a barrage of questions. My tendency as a reporter was to sneak around, get some information, and then approach them with some trepidation. Bill told me, just go up and ask them. He greeted them by name, and people on the fringe appreciate that. Bill was the first reporter to track the Idaho court case of Randy Weaver, a woodcutter with Christian identity beliefs who'd moved to Idaho from Iowa with his family and frequented the Aryan Nations compound. In 1989, Weaver had said yes to a federal informant's pitch to sell 2 shotguns with illegally sawed-off barrels. Bill reported that Weaver refused to show up in court after being arrested in December 1990, instead retreating to his mountain cabin north of Sandpoint. Bill found Weaver's location on a Forest Service map, chartered a Cessna, and took a bumpy ride with spokesman photographer Sean Jacobson to the site. Bill was the first to identify its location as Ruby Ridge. His March 1992 article made Ruby Ridge a national story. And Bill wrote 25 years later, little did I expect that the geographical reference point, Ruby Ridge, that I used, ultimately would become an American icon, representing a standoff between an individual, his family, and the power of the U.S. government. John Allison, a Spokane lawyer and former KXLY TV reporter, remembers getting a tip in August 1992 that a bunch of feds were swarming in to encircle Weaver's cabin. He immediately called Bill, who threw an ice chest in his truck with soda, beer, and cold cuts. We were there for 12 days, and Bill was working his sources. I never met anybody with so many sources, Ellison said. The pursuit of Weaver exploded into a tragic armed battle with federal agents, in which Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, his wife, Vicki, and federal agent and federal marshal, Sam Deegan, were killed. The Spokesman Review's coverage of the standoff by 5 reporters and 4 photographers earned the newspaper a Pulitzer Prize nomination. Ruby Ridge also led to Jess Walter's 1995 book, Every Knee Shall Bow, for which Bill contributed research. It also sparked the Patriot movement, which portrayed the Weavers as martyrs and the federal government as a totalitarian New World Order. These are people up on Ruby Ridge who had just learned that day that Sammy Weaver had been shot and killed. The arc of this violence that started at Ruby Ridge escalated a year later in Waco, Texas, the deadly standoff between the Branch Davidians and the federal agents that resulted in the deaths of 88 civilians and 4 ATF agents. It got even worse on April 9th, 1995, when a huge fertilizer bomb was detonated in front of the Oklahoma City Federal Courthouse, killing 168 people. That news sparked a rare standoff in the Spokesman Review newsroom over Bill's reporting. Jim Camden, the veteran spokesman political reporter, recalls that immediately after this bombing, the wire services were full of stories pointing to Arab terrorists, but Bill had sources that told him it was likely a far-right domestic operation. He'd read the Turner Diaries by Aryan Nation sympathizer William Pierce, whose fictional protagonist builds a fertilizer bomb and detonates it in front of a federal building to bring down the US government. Bill pushed for his story that day, but the copy desk balked, and it was held overnight. The next day, the wires reported that the FBI was looking for Timothy McVeigh, who had ties to homegrown extremists. Camden said that if Bill's original story had run, the spokesman would have been the first in the nation to report what had actually happened. The next day, Bill, says Camden, had a few unkind words for the editors and the copy desk, but he did give them an updated story. In the fall of 1995, Bill was invited by a militia group to observe their activities at a secret location. He and photographer Dan McComb were blindfolded and taken to a forest in the Idaho Panhandle. When the blindfolds were taken off, they were surrounded by masked men with powerful guns who conducted military-style drills and shot at targets in the shape of Hillary Clinton and federal agents. They also talked of killing police if they were stopped while traveling hot with automatic weapons. That same year, Bill went on to write about the Phineas priesthood, another Christian identity group that shared its ideology with the Aryan nations. Its plans included executing interracial couples and homosexuals, bombing abortion clinics, and robbing banks to finance their plots. He also interviewed Charles Barbie, a Sandpoint businessman who was organizing his own militia to fight the New World Order. These stories were published in December 1995. Bill had already seen signs of the Phineas priesthood at the Aryan Nations compound, and when he spotted its symbol on the belt buckle of a security guard, he asked the guard to pose for a photograph. It came in handy the next April when a series of attacks and retaliation for Morlin's stories occurred in Spokane. The next spring, Bill went off to cover the Montana Freeman armed standoff in eastern Montana. That was a group of 20 men who declared themselves sovereign citizens and refused to obey any state laws. While Bill was in Montana, a pipe bomb was placed at the Spokesman Review's Valley office on April 1st by the Phineas priesthood. The bomb was intended for Bill, according to court documents in the trial of the perpetrators. That bombing, and a similar one at Planned Parenthood's Spokane clinic, were planned as distractions while the extremists robbed the same Spokane bank twice. The FBI offered a $130,000 reward, and 4 Phineas priesthood members were arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. Bill's reporting eventually led to the demise of the Aryan Nations compound at Hayden Lake. The Southern Poverty Law Center filed a civil suit against the group in 2000, obtaining a $6.3 million judgment for a mother and son who were assaulted by the group. In 2001, the Aryan Nations compound was destroyed, and Bill was there to see it, recalls Tony Stewart, a retired North Idaho College professor and leader of a Coeur d'Alene human rights group founded in reaction to the Aryan Nations. We thought of maybe turning it into a museum, but Bill suggested to me that we should destroy it completely. If we kept it, he thought it would become a magnet for extremists. We tore down the 40-foot tower, the guardhouse, chopped down 2 trees with swastikas on them, and then turned it over to the fire district. We had them burn it down, Stewart said. Meanwhile, from his federal court beat in Spokane, Morlin Bill kept getting news scoops all the time. He broke the story of a massive phony diploma mill run by a Spokane woman, Dixie Randolph, following her arrest and trial. She was convicted, but the U.S. attorney went back on his promise to give Bill a list of all the people who bought phony diplomas. But Bill, of course, had a source in the federal building who gave him the list on an electronic disc. And Jim Camden, who was also a data expert, recalls being asked to help turn the list into a searchable database of about 10,000 names. It was a gold mine, and it kept giving us stories of people who had prominent jobs with phony diplomas. In 2001, Bill and Spokesman feature writer Jeanette Wade-Hopp produced a book published by the Spokesman Review on a very dark subject, the murder of 13 prostitutes in the late 1990s. Robert Yates, an unassuming family man, preyed on women working along the track, a bleak strip of pavements on East Sprague Avenue. It was a grim subject, but Jeanette recalls what a pleasure it was nonetheless to work with Bill. I always loved sitting next to Bill in the newsroom, partly because he had so many eureka moments in any given week. He'd pop out of his chair with a broad grin, eager to recount his latest reporting discovery. Jeanette was a gifted writer, and Bill was the investigative bulldog. When she'd stumble upon a new name in her reporting, she'd often hand it off to Bill, who made quick work of finding out nearly anything about anyone anywhere before social media and before an expanded internet, which made that much easier. The reporting duo fed off each other, completing a 31-part series for the newspaper, followed by the book. With Bill, it was pretty much eureka every day, Jeanette said. In 2005, towards the end of our journalism careers, Bill and I were teamed up by the Spokesman Review editor, Steve Smith, on a difficult investigation into Spokane's Mayor Jim West, a Republican who had been Senate Majority Leader in Olympia. It involved allegations about the sexual abuse of young boys while West had been a sheriff's deputy, plus newer information obtained through a computer expert that West was using city computers to meet young gay men on an internet dating site. Bill had worked the story following threads for years, but it was so sensitive that in the months before it was ready for publication, editor Steve Smith moved Bill and me out of the newsroom to a separate office. I used my Olympia contacts and the state archives to report on West's work in the Washington legislature, where he allied himself with right-wing religious groups to push anti-gay legislation, including a proposed bill that would have banned gays and lesbians from teaching in Washington's public schools. West, who at the time was one of Spokane's most successful politicians, was recalled in a special election the year after our stories were published. There's an important context for the reporting that Bill and I and many others were able to do at a regional, family-owned newspaper. In the 1980s, through the 90s, and into the 2000s, the Spokesman Review was a heavily staffed newsroom, which emphasized enterprise reporting and retained a law firm to back us up. While Bill was breaking major stories on extremism and crime, I was digging into Hanford's secretive operations that exposed people in this region to dangerous radiation. But as the newsroom budget began to shrink, talented journalists began to leave. To name just a few, Julie Sullivan to the Oregonian, where she shared in a public service Pulitzer, Kelly McBride, now vice president of the Poynter Institute in Florida, Ben Shores to a professorship at WSU, Jess Walter to book writing, and Jinda Feedy to a lead investigative reporter slot at CBS News, Miami. Bill and I opted to stay for another decade. We'd raised children in Spokane, loved the city, and still saw major opportunities to report. We both took buyouts and left the Spokesman Review on the same day, April Fool's Day 2009, because we could see the handwriting on the wall, a severely diminished staff with fading opportunities for investigative reporting, by then a nationwide trend. The day after retiring, Bill simply went back to work. As Ben said, he incorporated himself as Morlin Investigations, writing for the New York Times and continuing to file stories for the Southern Poverty Law Center. He used his investigative skills for several local attorneys, including his old reporting buddy, John Allison, now a partner in a major plaintiff's firm. Allison told me that Bill helped the firm track down victims of Jesuit priest sexual abuse at several schools in Washington, Idaho, and Montana, part of a $160 million settlement against the Oregon province of the Society of Jesus reached in 2011. Bill located adults who'd been abused in church boarding schools when they were 6 to 8 years old, including at St. Mary's School in Omak and St. Ignatius School in Montana. Bill had contributed to the SPLC's publication since the 1990s, said Mark Potok, a former Chicago Wire Service reporter who edited Bill's stories before his retirement from the Southern Poverty Law Center 5 years ago. It was a giant pleasure, Mark said. Bill was kind, generous, and super professional. Potok is now a senior fellow at the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right in London. In 2016, the center flew Bill from Spokane to its Montgomery, Alabama headquarters to visit with staff writers and editors. Potok had a large motorboat, and he took a group of these reporters up the Alabama River. We ran out of beer, Potok said, and we needed more. We saw a sign up on a hill that said Private Club, decorated with Confederate battle flags. A bunch of hostile guys were sitting around. It was a real scene, the Confederate version of Deliverance, he said. Bill, however, was not intimidated. Morlin strides to the bar, buys a membership, buys a case of beer, and walks out. He had no fear, and we were impressed, Potok said. Bill, writing for the SPLC, kept sounding the alarm about rising incidents of hate, which spiked in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama and rose again in 2016 after Donald Trump became president. He used a new global terrorism database to report that 2/3 of the 65 terror attacks carried out in the United States in 2017 were launched by domestic extremists. Bill, while doing this hard work, was careful to avoid emotional burnout, keeping balance in his life while covering these dark subjects. Leah Sotilli, the young journalist who Bill mentored, said he advised her of how important that was. Sotilli created the Bundyville podcast that some of you may have seen on that anti-government family, and wrote the 2022 book, When the Moon Turns to Blood, on the end-day Mormon sect whose members, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, are about to face trial in Idaho for a series of murders that included Vallow's children. Vallow's trial, as you probably know, started this week. After Bill's death, Sotilli wrote Hunting Hate, a tribute to him in the Guardian newspaper of England. She said he told her that he practiced sawdust therapy, making furniture and other items in his wood shop. She chose pottery for her outlet. Bill's wife, Connie, here today, said he had many outlets. He could hardly wait for winter, she said, taking his sons and grandkids to Canada for extended ski trips. A train buff from childhood, he loved running his huge model train set, over 300 cars. He also fired up his barbecue frequently. He loved, quoting Connie here, rum, Coke, and smoke. That was his favorite spot. Bill was also a staunch friend and parent. He showed up unasked to help Jess Walter and his wife Ann move. He raised his sons Scott and Jeff after a divorce, befriended immigrant kids in his neighborhood, and cherished his many pets. In short, Bill was a hard-bitten reporter who loved his friends, family, and community. Today's honor is the second that Bill has received since his death. I'm glad he knew that Professor Bill Shores had informed him of it before he died. Last November, Bill also became the inaugural recipient of Spokane's Bill Morlin Human Rights Journalism Award. In a column honoring Bill's work, Sean Vestal, the Spokesman Review columnist, issued a warning about journalism's future. It is very possible, Vestal wrote, especially these days, to imagine living in a community without a Bill Morlin, where the dark side remains in the dark, and where the hard work of digging up the difficult truths just never happens because staffs are too small, or the willingness to take part in the effort isn't there, or simply because the world is not full of journalists like Bill Morlin. So in closing, my challenge to the young journalists in this room is this: work hard to become the Bill Morlins of your generation. Our democracy needs you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was wonderful. All this work that Bill did, tremendous courage, and of course, had a strong family behind him. And so we'd like to invite the family up at this time to present this plaque to Bill on behalf of, in recognition of all his work. So please join us up here. Karen.
Perfect, thank you.
Bill may be gone, but his legacy, his work to seek truth and report it lives on through your work. So I'd like to invite Dean Bruce Pinkleton up to close us out here.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Karen. That was a moving tribute. I've been a Spokesman Review reader for about 30 years now and read a lot of those stories, as a matter of fact, and tremendously impactful for me personally as well for this region and our world, clearly. Very, very appreciative of that and appreciative of the terrific work of the Spokesman Review. I'd like to talk about the Murrow family, and I hope that each of you feel like you're a part of the Murrow family. When we think of the work we do in Murrow College, we think about his ethics, his courage, and his professional excellence. And we don't want to merely reflect that, but we want to impart that to our students, to those around us, to our community. And we want to grow that legacy so that it's not stale, but it's something that continues to evolve as communication techniques evolve, as our world evolves, as the issues around us evolve. So in the words of our own Edward R. Murrow, actually I'm going to change the words just a little bit. Rather than saying good night and good luck, I'll say good afternoon, good luck. Thank you very much for coming. Everyone take care.